Hi guys, so this is a race and ethnicity lecture. We actually did this the week before. We had our unannounced unknown for self-isolation and self-quarantine. So this is going to be our first lecture in an online space, in our online learning for you guys. But I just wanted to make sure that you all had some information on race and ethnicity, since there are a lot of vocabulary words within this lecture. So I wanted to make sure that everybody saw this and everybody has this information before going forward, because this is something that we would need to know to help our understanding of course content. So here it is in our online learning space. So this is the danger of the single story, and I am going to just play a little bit of this for you guys right now, just the first couple minutes of it, because I think it's an important idea.
So after I spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my own race responsibility. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I would still say that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful islands, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreign. I would see Africans in the same way I, as a child, had seen Fide's life.
So this author, who has written a lot of books, is talking about a single story. So hers is of a housekeeper's son, and her only single story of him is that he's poor. Her roommate, when she comes to the United States, only sees her as an African and only has a kind of stereotypical view because of what she hears on the media. And you might have similar things about you. There might be a single story that you've had about people in your life, and there might be single stories that people have about you because of your race or your gender or your accent or the language you speak or the work that you do. So we want to understand these types of ideas, and we're going to kind of think through this lecture based on the idea of a single story. A lot of times we have a single story about somebody from a different race. So it is a biological definition. So a lot of times people who are of African descent are going to share similar genetic characteristics and facial features. Their skin might be deeper in tone, and then genetic characteristics because of their common ancestry from Africa, they might have built-in genetic kind of protections against things like malaria. Same with people who are Caucasian, having come from European countries. We typically have paler skin. We don't need as much melanin to make our skin darker because there's not as much sun. We'll typically have lighter eyes as well. So we might look similar, but there's going to be a lot of variation with that, and we might have genetic characteristics as well. Cystic fibrosis is kind of a lung disease that is very common in Caucasian people. We also have a sociological definition because while there are biological differences, most humans, our DNA is 99.8% similar. So it's only kind of that 0.02 which makes us look different within our DNA. We're pretty much identical as humans on a DNA level. But we also have some sociology kind of definitions of race as well. So we kind of have socially constructed kind of single stories about people of different races, and they can be positive or they can be negative. So the author's roommate was probably not trying to be racist, but her single story is that anybody who comes from Africa and is Black is going to be coming from a poverty situation, whereas that author came from a very, very middle class background. So we have these ideas of race and their differences, but then we have all ideas of racism. And if I had to give you a definition of racism, it would be our attitudes, our values, and our beliefs that are then translated into our practices, so how we act with other people, that are used to justify the belief that a race is superior or inferior to other people. So one race is better or worse than others. So that's the kind of traditional look at racism. And then we have institutional racism, which is racism that's in our social institutions. So healthcare, social services, transportation, anything like that could be a social institution. So institutional racism in healthcare could be that 1 in 5 women, Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. And that's adjusting for college education. So a white woman and a Black woman of the same socioeconomic status and the same educational background a Black woman is still more than 5 times more likely to die in childbirth. So a lot of times we're looking at healthcare and women and children dying in childbirth. We're usually looking at socioeconomic levels because prenatal care, being able to get to hospitals, good doctors would mean a lot if you were delivering, but that actually doesn't even matter. You could have access to wonderful prenatal care and they'll still kind of have the 5-time larger chance of dying in childbirth if you're a Black woman. So this infographic that I have is information about people who have been in prison or in jail in their lifespan. So for all men, regardless of race or ethnicity, 1 in 9 men will be in jail or in prison in their lifetime. 1 in 17 white men, 1 in 3 Black men, and 1 in 6 Latino or Hispanic men. So for women, it's 1 in 56. So all women, 1 in 56 will have spent time in prison or in jail. White women, it will be 1 in 111. Black women, it will be 1 in 18. And Latina women, it will be 1 in 45. So we do know that there are some racial differences with prison sentences, like the differences between crack and cocaine and how much you can have being considered intent to sell or not. Cocaine being seen as a higher socioeconomic drug and crack being seen as a lower class kind of drug. You can have a lot less crack and that can be seen as intent to sell, and you can have a lot of cocaine and it could just be seen as personal use. So that's an example of institutional racism. So healthcare, prison sentences, your ability to access transportation, housing, all of those are social institutions that racism might be part of. Ethnicity is a state of belonging to a social group that has a common cultural ancestry, national, or traditional background. So you could be ethnically Polish, so your family comes from Poland, you enjoy Polish food, you have a good sense of being Polish in your self-identity, in your family identity, you take a lot of pride in it. You might still speak some Polish and your grandparents might speak more, and you might engage in traditions or rituals around weddings, births, deaths that are seen as traditionally Polish as well. So examples would be our war in Serbia, Bosnia, and Montenegro. In the 1990s, there were a lot of ethnic tensions and religious tensions in this part of the world, and there was a war and many deaths because of people who were seen as ethnically Serbian, ethnically Bosnian, and then also there were religious undertones between Christian and Muslims as well. Same with the Sudan, which is a country in Africa, which has just recently started to end their civil war. There were lots of tribal ethnicities that contributed to a large-scale war and humanitarian crisis as well. So prejudice, in sociology, we typically see this as an attitude towards a group and its individual members. It's biased thoughts based on flawed assumptions. So in this picture, you might like light orange goldfish and not brown goldfish because you have a flawed assumption that brown goldfish are more aggressive or will steal the food of the other goldfish. So you might have a flawed assumption based on your interaction with one brown goldfish, and so you're going to be biased and not want to buy any of the brown goldfish when they're just the same as the orange goldfish, they just have a different colored scale. It typically arises from an us versus them group identity as well. All right, so we have minorities as well, and these are groups of people who are typically in the position of being minoritized. So they are singled out for others for differential or unequal treatment. So typically we'll have a dominant group, and this is a group of people who have more power in a society than other groups. So a minority or more minoritized group could be as simple as, and I gave this example before, in California, we could say that a minority group would be people born and raised in Texas. So most of the people who live in California are going to be Californians. You were born and raised here, but a minority might be people from Texas. Now that could be pretty simple if we didn't have any ideas about people from Texas. But let's say we've got ideas that they all eat too much barbecue, they all say y'all, they all wear cowboy hats, and they're not very smart. That might be your idea about the minority Texas population in California, because of maybe you ran into one person from Texas and they fit all of those boxes, but then you might meet another person from Texas, you might not get to know him because you're like, you know, he's just gonna say y'all, he's just gonna try to get me to eat barbecue, and they're not too bright. Well, that's a flawed idea, and that's a stereotype and a prejudice that you might have about a minority Texas group in California. So we want to make sure that our ideas about minorities are not based on flawed assumptions, because a lot of times this can be seen Hispanic people as a minority within the United States, and they might have some kind of issues with their culture and their language and their accents as they live in a place where they are not the majority group. All right, now I want to jump to prejudice. So this is a generalization, if we were going to look at a prejudice, a generalization based on a bias or incomplete or slanted information. So in my example of people from Texas, you have biased or incomplete or just wrong information about people from Texas, and this might give you a prejudice against that minority Texas group. It can be difficult to change, even if you have a lot of evidence based on the, you work with a lot of Texans, they're super smart, they're super fun, and they're all vegans. And they've never worn a cowboy hat in their life, but you have strong emotions based on that one interaction with that one person from Texas, and you've now prejudiced an entire minority group based on maybe not a lot of information on it either. If we are holding a lot of biased opinions, that can also lead to discrimination. So our prejudice against one person could even end up with discrimination. So let's say you become the boss, you still have a prejudice against people from Texas, and you're not going to hire them anymore either, because now you're discriminating against them. So discrimination is your opinions that lead to you treating people unfairly. So it can be avoiding social contact. So, oh, there's going to be a lot of Texans there, I'm not going to that party. Or denying them positions of authority. Well, I'm not going to promote that Texan, he's going to make me eat barbecue. Or blocking their access to socially desirable goods. He can't come with us to that restaurant. He's not going to know how to act. So advanced education, well-paying jobs, expensive goods and services, or even desirable neighborhoods. We've noticed that when certain minority groups in, people will move into neighborhoods, people who are of a higher socioeconomic status or a different race will start to move because they see the neighborhood as declining in value. So with our prejudice can also end up with stereotypes. So the picture I have is about some of the stereotypes that these children have felt against them. So Muslims are not all terrorists. She can marry whoever she wants. I'm not just a color. I'm not going to cut your grass. I'm not white trash. Not all Asians are studious, and we're not all Mexican. So if you speak Spanish or you're Hispanic, does not mean that every single person comes from Mexico. You could come from Honduras. You could come from anywhere in Central America as well. Stereotyping is an exaggeration or an oversimplification applied to all members of a group. So we're doing that when we stereotype people from Texas. They all wear cowboy hats. Well, I've been to Texas many times, and some people wear cowboy hats and a lot of people don't. It's very negative and very damaging to that group. So we get a lot of stereotypes as Americans. If you've ever been abroad in other countries, they think we all eat terribly, we're all overweight, we all have guns, we all, are rude and too loud and aggressive and things like that. So that could be a stereotype of us as Americans in other countries. And I would see that a lot when I lived in England years ago when I got my grad degree. I was the exception. Oh, I literally had somebody tell me, I don't usually like Americans, but you're okay. And it was like, okay, well, we don't need to have this conversation anymore, because it was incredibly rude. I don't think this person saw it that way, but I was the exception. So I don't know very many Americans, but I have this idea that you're all awful and rude and too loud and aggressive, but you are not like that, so you're the exception. You're okay, you're cool, even though I don't like Americans. It can also lead to segregation as well. I mean, the United States is a very, very segregated area. So the yellow is low to moderate, orange is high, and red is extreme. So back east, we have a more extreme kind of segregation in the larger areas like Chicago, New York City, Baltimore, and Annapolis, Miami, Tampa, New Orleans, I think that's Houston, Atlanta. So some of the larger areas, we have a lot of segregation between the races. You know, Black neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods, Irish neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods. We have some, we're definitely high in California as well. And we could make the argument that it's because we have so many different types of people, but we also want to make sure that anybody can live wherever they want. You don't have to live in, you know, just because you're white, you don't have to live by the beach and be a surfer. You could live wherever you want. And just because you speak Spanish, you could live in La Jolla or a larger, more affluent area as well. Unfortunately, when we get to racism and prejudice and stereotypes, this can lead to hate crimes. And a hate crime is a specific federal, state, and local idea of a criminal act motivated by extreme prejudice. So making a swastika and writing die on a Jewish person's car would be an example of a criminal act and a hate crime as well, because you're targeting this person just because they're Jewish. A lot of times it's related to race, religion, if somebody's gay or straight or perceived as one way or another, their ethnicity, and even their disability as well. So African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Jews, gays and lesbians, and people with disabilities are often targeted. So we have hate crime legislation because of Matthew Shepard right here in the black and white, and James Byrd in the colorized picture on the right. And that's because in the 1990s, we had a lot of murders. Both Matthew Shepard and James Byrd were both murdered. Matthew Shepard because he was gay, and James Byrd because he was Black. Matthew Shepard was lured out of a bar and he was beaten and left to die in a freezing field in Wyoming, and James Byrd was dragged behind a truck until he died as well. And so in 2009, a tougher law was passed. We had some in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but in 2009, a very stringent law about hate crimes was passed in honor of both of these men who died just because of who they were. So the Hate Crime Statistics Act, really we try to keep track of these, so they don't always have to be murders or beatings. They could be discriminating against somebody, tagging a synagogue with swastikas, graffiti, anything like that, and we keep track of it to see where it's happening as well, and there has been an uptick in recent years as well. And so we want to kind of make sure that these hate crimes don't happen again. So this is a drawing of James Byrd because, once again, he was dragged behind a truck with chains in Texas. So that is my lecture this week, because I wanted to make sure that you had good definitions for race, ethnicity, stereotypes, prejudice, institutional racism. So we did this in class, but it was a smaller group, and then we had kind of an uptick in coronavirus, and we've now gone online. So this week, I just wanted to make sure that I gave you guys those definitions so that you can use them and you feel comfortable with them, so we can move on with this class. All right, I will see you guys online, and please check online for your new kind of online learning formats and the new assignments that I have as well. All right, I will see you guys online.